Republican Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri says he will not seek re-election next year.
After 14 general election victories, 3 to county office, 7 to the United States House of Representatives, and 4 statewide elections, I won't be a candidate for re-election to the United States Senate next year.
Blunt is the 5th Republican senator to announce he'll retire at the end of his term. The GOP is set on regaining control of the chamber in the 2022 midterms. But Republicans will be trying to hang on to 20 seats compared to just 14 for Democrats. And a new report from New York Magazine suggests Democrats may have more reasons to be optimistic. A newly published interview with former Obama campaign data analyst David Shor breaks down findings from polls and surveys conducted after the 2020 election. In it, Shor outlines how former President Trump was good for the GOP and how Democrats can win in 2022. New York Magazine reporter Eric Levitz is behind that story and joins me now. Eric, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So I want to discuss your interview with political data analyst David Shor, who analyzed voter data and post-election surveys. What are his takeaways about how the electorate has changed between 2016 and 2020?
Yeah, so in his analysis, which is based upon precinct-level data and post-election sort of large number surveys, as well as individual-level vote history data, which is available in some states, all more reliable sources of information than the exit polls that are widely reported on election night. These suggest that there was a 9-point swing among Hispanic voters towards Donald Trump. So Trump won 9% more in the two-way vote between the Democratic nominee and Republican nominee, than he had against Hillary Clinton in 2016. On the other hand, there was a 7% movement among college-educated white voters towards the Democratic Party, towards Joe Biden. So he did 7% better with that demographic than Hillary Clinton did. Then there was about, sort of very low-level movement among non-college educated white voters who Trump did so well with in 2016. They seemed to move about a point back towards the Democrats. Conversely, among African-American voters, there was about a 1 or 2 point movement towards Trump. So those were the big headline in terms of just the shifts among subgroups that seemed to really shape the terrain of the election. And those shifts partially explain why, early on election night, things looked pretty bleak for Democrats because Florida came in much more strongly pro-Trump than anticipated. This was largely because of this really massive shift among Hispanic voters who are a major part of that state's electorate. But thankfully for the Democratic Party from their perspective, this shift was not replicated among other subgroups. And so ultimately Biden did end up, being able to assemble an electoral college majority.
So, yeah, Eric, let's dig into that a little bit more. So Democrats, as you noted, lost up to 2% in support from Black Americans, 9% among Hispanic voters, and a nearly 5% drop in Asian American support. So what does Shor say actually happened there?
Yeah, so, it's he's, a little bit more authoritative on what happened than on why it happened. But he has a couple of, reasoned surmises about it. So, one thing that he notes, and one of the things that you can really get from precinct level data is sort of really fine-grained information about how certain subgroups voted. So what he's found is that there was this large shift among Hispanic voters broadly, like really across different, obviously Hispanic is a very large umbrella category. But so, Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, across the board, and also across the country, there was some movement towards Republicans. But the really biggest shifts were actually among, it appears, Colombian and Venezuelan Americans. So there are certain precincts, such as one in, Doral, Florida, a neighborhood that's heavily Venezuelan, heavily Colombian, American emigre community. And there's a precinct in that neighborhood that went 40% for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and then 10% for Donald Trump. In 2020, so a 50-point swing. So from that, he reasons that, what separates Venezuelan and Colombian Americans from other Hispanic Americans? Socialism has a very high salience meaning in those countries because of the FARC paramilitaries in Colombia and the experience with Maduro and Chavez in Venezuela. Socialism, especially among people who left those countries, partially in response to the domestic situation there, socialism has a negative and very high salience, very relevant meaning to them. And so it's conceivable that with the rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders and the heightened salience of that may have influenced a portion of the Hispanic vote. The other thing that he looks at among Hispanic voters more broadly is that when you look at, with his survey data, you sort of could identify the subset of voters, Hispanic voters, that voted for Clinton in 2016 and then Trump in 2020, and then looked at just the policy questions that they had asked those voters separately and sort of see, what distinguishes this group of Hispanic voters from others? Is there anything, in particular that they seem to share in terms of their issue preferences? And what he found was that the more conservative a Hispanic voter was on policing, crime and public safety, the more likely they were to flip from Clinton to Trump, and that, separately, that conservative views on other issues weren't quite as predictive as moving from Clinton in 2016 to Trump in 2020. And so from this, sorry.
No, I'm so sorry. Our time is running short here, and I want to make sure that I get you, Eric. I'm looking ahead here to 2022 and the midterms. Shor says that there is a strong case for thinking that politics will not follow any sort of traditional scenario. So what does he think are going to be sort of the driving policy issues come 2022?
Yeah, so I think that the big things from his perspective are that, on the one hand, Republicans have a very solid position in terms of throughout history, the past 4 decades, the party, the out of power party tends to gain seats in midterms. The party whose voters, have their person in the White House tend to get a little bit complacent in midterms and not turn out as much. That plus the fact that the House map is kind of gerrymandered in Republicans' favor puts the GOP in a fairly strong starting position. But, what we've seen, new estimates even today from Wall Street's major banks are expecting a pretty extraordinary level of economic growth over the next 2 years as the country rebounds from COVID. And this gives an opportunity to Democrats to really break the trend of history and to, in fact, actually gain seats in a midterm, at least potentially, if they can, keep the salience of economic issues high and, keep Biden's approval rating above 50%.
Be really interesting to see how these dynamics play out. Eric Levitz for us. Eric, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.